Tonight we will explore 100 of the most widely believed myths about art, artists, and the art world stories that most people accept as true, but that turn out, on closer examination, to be incomplete, exaggerated, or entirely false. As you relax and unwind, you will hear the common version of each story, and then the more interesting and more accurate truth that lies behind it, moving gently through the history of art and the remarkable gap between what most people think they know and what actually happened. There is no need to stay awake for every detail. Simply listen, rest, and let the quiet correction of 100 familiar stories gently guide you towards sleep. Many people believe that Vincent van Gogh cut off his entire ear in a fit of madness following his argument with Paul Gauguin, an act of spectacular self-mutilation that has become one of the most repeated and most dramatic stories in the history of art. The truth is considerably less dramatic. Van Gogh cut off only the lower portion of his left ear, not the entire ear, and the wound, while serious, was not the spectacular act of total self-destruction that popular accounts typically suggest. He wrapped the severed portion in cloth and brought it to a woman at a nearby establishment, and he was found the following morning by police and taken to the hospital where he was treated and survived. The specific circumstances of the argument with Gauguin that preceded the incident remain genuinely disputed by historians, with some researchers suggesting that the standard account of events may significantly misrepresent what actually happened that evening in Arles. It is widely believed that the Mona Lisa has always been the most famous painting in the world, a work so obviously extraordinary that its supreme status in the hierarchy of Western art has been recognized since the moment Leonardo completed it in the early 16th century. In reality, the Mona Lisa was relatively obscure for most of its existence, hanging in various French royal collections without attracting particular public attention for more than 3 centuries. Its transformation into the most famous painting in the world was almost entirely the result of its theft from the Louvre in 1911 by an Italian handyman named Vincenzo Perugia, which generated an enormous international press response that brought the painting to the attention of millions of people who had previously been unaware of it. Before the theft, the painting was far less celebrated than many other works in the Louvre's collection, and it was the 2 years of its absence, rather than its artistic qualities, that produced the global fascination it now commands. Most people believe that Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling lying on his back, looking upward at the wet plaster above him, in a position of heroic physical discomfort that has become one of the most familiar images of artistic suffering in popular culture. This is entirely false. Michelangelo painted the ceiling standing upright on a system of curved wooden scaffolding that he designed himself, his head tilted sharply backward to look at the surface above him. He did not lie on his back at any point during the 4 years of the ceiling's creation. The misconception appears to have originated with a misreading of his own description of the physical demands of the work, in which he complained about the discomfort of working with his head tilted backward, and was cemented by Irving Stone's novel and the subsequent Hollywood film, both of which depicted him lying on his back in a dramatically compelling but historically inaccurate manner. There is a common belief that Leonardo da Vinci was primarily a painter whose scientific and engineering investigations were a secondary interest pursued alongside his main career as a visual artist, a gifted amateur who dabbled in science in his spare time. The truth is almost the reverse. Leonardo produced fewer than 20 completed paintings across a career spanning more than 4 decades, making him one of the least productive of all the major Renaissance painters by purely quantitative measure, while his notebooks, approximately 5,000 pages of which survive from an estimated total of more than 13,000, contain investigations of extraordinary depth and systematic rigor across anatomy, geology, hydraulics, optics, botany, aeronautics, and dozens of other fields. Many of the scientists and engineers who have studied his notebooks have argued that his scientific investigations were not simply a supplement to his artistic career, but the primary expression of an intelligence for which painting was only one among many equally serious modes of engagement with the natural world. Many people believe that the Impressionist painters were immediately recognized as revolutionary geniuses by the French art world, and that their work was enthusiastically received from the moment it was first publicly shown, a narrative of immediate and unambiguous artistic triumph that the subsequent celebration of Impressionism seems to confirm. The reality was almost entirely the opposite. The first Impressionist exhibition, held in 1874, was received with predominantly hostile and often contemptuous reviews, with critics describing the paintings as unfinished, incompetent, and offensive to the standards of serious art. The term Impressionism itself was coined as an insult by a critic who used the title of Monet's impression Sunrise as a way of mocking what he considered the painting's lack of finish and technical rigor. It took more than a decade of sustained critical advocacy, commercial promotion by dealers including Paul Durand-Ruel, and a gradual shift in public taste before Impressionism achieved anything approaching the mainstream acceptance it now enjoys. It is widely believed that Caravaggio was an entirely self-taught painter whose revolutionary approach to light and darkness emerged from nothing, a genius who invented his style without any significant artistic antecedents or influences. In fact, Caravaggio received a thorough conventional training in the workshop of the Milanese painter Simone Peterzano, who had himself been a student of Titian, and the Lombard tradition in which he was educated placed particular emphasis on the realistic depiction of the natural world and the careful observation of light and shadow that would become the foundation of his mature style. He also had access in Rome to the work of northern Italian painters, including Giovanni Girolamo, Savoldo, and Lorenzo Lotto, who had explored the dramatic possibilities of artificial light before him. His achievement was extraordinary, but it grew from a specific artistic tradition rather than from nothing, and the idea of the completely self-invented genius misrepresents the degree to which even the most radical artistic innovations are shaped by the traditions that precede and surround them. Many people believe that Pablo Picasso invented Cubism entirely on his own, a solitary act of creative genius that transformed the course of Western art through the force of a single exceptional individual's vision. The historical reality is that Cubism was developed jointly and simultaneously by Picasso and Georges Braque in a period of such close artistic collaboration that the two painters themselves sometimes had difficulty remembering which of them had made specific paintings. They worked in direct proximity, exchanged ideas continuously, and pushed each other's thinking in directions that neither would have reached independently, and the development of Cubism between approximately 1907 and 1914 was as much a collaborative achievement as an individual one. Braque's contribution to the movement has been consistently undervalued in popular accounts that follow the convention of attributing artistic revolutions to single heroic figures. There is a popular belief that artists throughout history have been poor and unrecognized during their lifetimes, struggling in garrets and dying in obscurity only to be celebrated by later generations, a romantic narrative of misunderstood genius that has shaped the popular image of the artist since at least the Romantic period. While this narrative accurately describes the experience of some artists, Van Gogh being the most frequently cited example, it profoundly misrepresents the experience of the majority of the most celebrated artists in Western history. Rubens was enormously wealthy and socially prominent during his lifetime, serving as a diplomatic ambassador for the Spanish crown alongside his painting career. Raphael was celebrated and sought after throughout his brief career. Bernini was so successful that he effectively shaped the physical appearance of Rome over 6 decades of papal patronage. Titian lived to nearly 100 years old in a state of considerable prosperity and social distinction. The struggling artist dying in poverty is the exception rather than the rule in the history of art. Most people believe that the Venus de Milo, the celebrated ancient Greek sculpture now displayed in the Louvre, was found in perfect condition, and that her missing arms were lost sometime after the sculpture's discovery on the island of Melos in 1820. In reality, the arms were already missing when the sculpture was found, and the circumstances of their loss are entirely unknown. Several fragments were found alongside the main sculpture at the time of its discovery, including a hand holding an apple and a plinth with an inscription bearing a sculptor's name, but these were separated from the main sculpture during the political negotiations over its acquisition by the French government, and were subsequently lost, leaving the famous armless figure as the only portion of the work to reach the Louvre. Various proposals about the original pose of the arms have been made by scholars across the nearly 2 centuries since the sculpture's discovery, none of which has achieved scholarly consensus. It is commonly believed that the ancient Greeks and Romans created their marble sculptures in the pure brilliant white that the surviving originals display in museums today, and that the aesthetic of white marble has been central to the classical tradition from its origins. Ancient Greek and Roman sculptures were extensively painted in vivid colors, skin tones, patterned garments, colored hair, and detailed accessories, and the pure white marble that the modern world has come to associate with classical antiquity is simply the result of the paint having worn away across the centuries since these works were made. Modern technical analysis of surviving sculptures has identified traces of pigments that allow scholars to reconstruct the original painted appearance of many ancient works, and the reconstructions that have resulted more vivid, more colorful, and more decorative than the unpainted originals continue to challenge and revise the understanding of ancient art that Western culture had constructed over centuries of engagement with works from which the color had entirely disappeared. Many people believe that the Parthenon in Athens was always a ruin, that its current fragmentary state represents an ancient condition rather than the result of more recent destruction, and that the building was already largely as we see it when European travelers began visiting Athens in the Renaissance and early modern periods. The Parthenon was substantially intact as late as the 17th century of the Common Era, having served successively as a Greek temple, a Christian church, and a mosque across its long history. It was destroyed not by the passage of time, but by an explosion in 1687, when a Venetian artillery shell struck a Turkish powder magazine that had been stored inside the building, causing an explosion that blew out the central portion of the structure and killed several hundred people who were sheltering inside. The ruin that visitors see today is therefore the result of a specific historical event rather than the gradual decay of antiquity, and the building's destruction is only about 340 years in the past. There is a widespread belief that Salvador Dali's famous melting clocks in The Persistence of Memory were inspired by a theory of Einstein's about the relativity of time, a neat narrative that connects the most famous surrealist painting to the most famous scientific theory of the 20th century. Dali himself consistently rejected this interpretation and offered a considerably more prosaic account of the painting's origin, saying that he had been inspired by the sight of a piece of camembert cheese melting in the sun one afternoon in his studio in Cadaqués, and that the melting watches had come to him in a sudden vision while he was contemplating the softening cheese. Whether this account is entirely accurate or represents one of Dali's characteristic acts of self-mythologizing is difficult to determine, but the Einstein connection appears to have been entirely a creation of viewers and critics, rather than anything the painter himself acknowledged or intended. Most people believe that Frida Kahlo was a surrealist painter whose work was central to the surrealist movement and who identified with surrealism as her primary artistic affiliation throughout her career. Kahlo consistently and emphatically rejected the surrealist label throughout her life, insisting that she did not paint dreams or unconscious fantasies in the manner of Dali or Magritte, but direct depictions of her own lived reality. The association between her work and surrealism was primarily the creation of the French surrealist leader André Breton, who encountered her paintings during a visit to Mexico in 1938 and enthusiastically promoted them as surrealist works, a categorization that Kahlo found both inaccurate and irritating. She is reported to have said that she never painted dreams but her own reality, and that what Breton called surrealism in her work was simply the most direct way she knew of depicting the world as she actually experienced it. It is commonly believed that Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci were close friends and mutual admirers who engaged in a productive creative dialogue throughout the period when both were working in Florence in the early 16th century. The historical record suggests almost the opposite. The two men appear to have maintained a relationship of mutual wariness and professional rivalry that expressed itself in publicly reported hostile exchanges and a consistent tendency to keep their distance from each other whenever possible. Michelangelo was openly contemptuous of Leonardo's failure to complete major projects, including the bronze horse monument for the Duke of Milan, while Leonardo appears to have found Michelangelo's single-minded sculptural focus artistically limiting. The idea of a warm and mutually admiring friendship between the two greatest artists of the Renaissance is a retrospective construction that the actual historical record of their relationship does not support. Many people believe that the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the group of English painters who formed in 1848 in deliberate opposition to the artistic mainstream, were championed from the beginning by the critics and the public who recognized in their work a refreshing alternative to the stale conventions of academic painting. In fact, the Pre-Raphaelites initially received extremely hostile critical reviews, with their early exhibitions attracting mockery, contempt, and accusations of both aesthetic incompetence and moral impropriety from the majority of the contemporary press. It was the intervention of the critic John Ruskin, who wrote a celebrated letter to the Times in 1851, defending their work on aesthetic and moral grounds, that began the transformation of their critical fortunes. And even after Ruskin's advocacy, the group's reception remained deeply divided for several years before the broader shift in Victorian taste that eventually made their work not simply acceptable but enormously popular. There is a common belief that Vermeer was a celebrated and widely recognized painter during his lifetime, whose work was admired across the Dutch Republic and beyond, as among the finest genre painting being produced during the Dutch Golden Age. Vermeer was in fact a relatively obscure local painter during his lifetime, working primarily for a small number of regular local patrons in Delft and achieving very little of the broader recognition that several of his contemporaries enjoyed. He died in 1675, leaving his wife and 11 children in debt, and his work was almost entirely forgotten for nearly 2 centuries following his death. His rediscovery in the middle of the 19th century, driven primarily by the advocacy of the French critic Théophile Thoré, transformed him from an obscure provincial painter into one of the most celebrated artists in the history of Dutch painting, and the contrast between his obscurity during his lifetime and his current canonical status is one of the most dramatic examples of posthumous critical reversal in the history of art. Most people believe that the Impressionist painter Claude Monet was always primarily interested in the natural landscape and the depiction of outdoor light, spending his entire career painting in the open air, in the tradition of plein air painting that Boudin had introduced him to as a young man. While the open-air landscape was indeed central to Monet's practice for most of his career, his final and most celebrated body of work, the Great Water Lilies paintings produced in the last 2 decades of his life, and now displayed in the Orangerie in Paris, was painted almost entirely in a purpose-built studio, at Giverny, not outdoors. The enormous canvases of the Grandes decorations were too large to be transported and worked on in the garden, and Monet spent his final years working indoors on a scale and in conditions that were entirely different from the plein-air practice with which his name is most commonly associated. The paintings were also reworked repeatedly over many years, a process of sustained studio revision entirely at odds with the impression of spontaneous outdoor painting that the Impressionist label tends to suggest. It is widely believed that the theft of the Mona Lisa from the Louvre in 1911 was a sophisticated and carefully planned operation executed by a team of professional art thieves using elaborate methods to defeat the museum's security systems. The theft was in fact remarkably simple and almost entirely unplanned in its execution. Vincenzo Peruggia, an Italian handyman who had previously worked at the Louvre installing protective glass cases for the paintings, simply hid inside the museum overnight, removed the painting from the wall the following morning, concealed it under his coat, and walked out of the building. The museum's security was so inadequate that the painting was not discovered to be missing until the following day, and Peruggia kept it in his apartment in Paris for more than 2 years before attempting to sell it in Florence, where he was caught. The sophisticated heist of popular imagination was in reality one of the most straightforwardly executed art thefts in history. Many people believe that Jackson Pollock's drip paintings, which he produced by pouring and dripping paint onto canvas laid on the floor, were created in a state of uncontrolled emotional frenzy, chaotic, accidental works produced without conscious artistic intention or control. Pollock himself consistently and forcefully rejected this characterization, insisting that he maintained complete control of the painting process, and that every decision about where the paint fell, how it was applied, and, when the work was complete, was made with deliberate artistic intention. He described being in the painting while he worked, moving around the canvas with a full awareness of the compositional decisions he was making at every moment. The photographs and films of him working that were made during his most productive period show a man moving with careful deliberation rather than frenzied abandon, and the formal qualities of his finest drip paintings, their balance, their spatial complexity, their sense of controlled energy, are inconsistent with the idea of uncontrolled accident. There is a popular belief that the great cathedrals of medieval Europe were built by anonymous craftsmen, whose names and individual contributions are entirely lost to history, humble laborers who submerge their individual identities in the collective service of God and the Church. While it is true that the names of many individual craftsmen who worked on medieval cathedrals are unknown, the master builders and architects who designed these extraordinary structures were frequently well-documented figures of considerable social distinction and professional reputation, whose names, contracts, and sometimes personal biographies survive in the historical record. The master mason William of Sens was brought from France to rebuild the choir of Canterbury Cathedral in 1174 and is documented in the contemporary chronicle of Gervase of Canterbury. The architects of the great Gothic cathedrals were skilled professionals who commanded high fees and whose reputations were known across Europe, and the image of the anonymous humble craftsman misrepresents the professional culture within which the cathedrals were designed and built. Most people believe that Pablo Picasso was universally celebrated as a genius throughout his career, and that his work was immediately recognized as important and valuable by collectors and institutions from the very beginning of his professional life. Picasso experienced significant poverty and professional difficulty during his early years in Paris, living in genuine destitution in the communal artist's studio known as the Bateau Lavoir in Montmartre during the first years of the 20th century and selling his early work for very small sums to survive. His breakthrough came gradually through the advocacy of a small number of collectors, most importantly Gertrude and Leo Stein, who began purchasing his work in the mid-1900s, and even after his reputation began to develop, he remained a controversial and in many quarters genuinely disliked figure, whose work attracted hostility as well as admiration. The image of the universally acclaimed genius obscures a career that was in its early stages as materially difficult as those of many artists whose work has never achieved recognition. It is commonly believed that the term Old Master refers to a precise technical category with a specific and universally agreed definition that clearly distinguishes the works it encompasses from those it excludes. In practice, the term has no single agreed definition and is used differently in different contexts and by different institutions. It generally refers to paintings produced by European artists working before approximately 1800, but the specific boundaries are fuzzy and contested. Some institutions extend the category to include early 19th century works. Others restrict it more narrowly, and the term is sometimes applied to artists working outside the European tradition in ways that reflect the Eurocentric assumptions of the art market rather than any neutral art historical judgment. The apparent precision of the category conceals a significant degree of conventional agreement and institutional habit rather than a clear principled distinction. Many people believe that the Venus de Milo was created by the ancient Greek sculptor Praxiteles, one of the most celebrated artists of the 4th century before the Common Era, a connection that gives the sculpture an authorship that seems to match its extraordinary quality and that has been widely repeated in popular accounts of the work. The attribution to Praxiteles is entirely without foundation and was never seriously supported by scholarly evidence. The inscription, found alongside the sculpture at the time of its discovery, bore the name of a different sculptor, Alexandros of Antioch, but this inscription was separated from the sculpture during the diplomatic negotiations over its acquisition and was subsequently lost, and the French authorities chose not to publicize the inscription's existence because it did not fit the narrative of a classical masterpiece by a celebrated ancient artist that would justify the pride of a major acquisition. The Venus de Milo remains an anonymous work whose specific attribution is unknown. There is a widespread belief that the pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti buried the manuscript of his poems in the coffin of his wife Elizabeth Siddal when she died in 1862, and that he later had the coffin exhumed to retrieve the poems, a story so dramatically Gothic that it has become one of the most frequently repeated anecdotes in the history of Victorian art. Both parts of the story are substantially true, making this one of the rare cases where the dramatic popular account is essentially accurate, but the details are typically misrepresented in ways that intensify the Gothic quality of the episode at the expense of its psychological and human complexity. Rossetti did indeed bury the manuscript with Siddal as an act of grief and remorse, and he did have the coffin exhumed 7 years later at the instigation of his literary agent, who convinced him that the poems were too important to be lost. The exhumation was carried out at night, and the poems were recovered and eventually published, but the psychological cost to Rossetti of the episode appears to have been considerable. Most people believe that ancient Egyptian art remained essentially unchanged across 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization, producing works of such consistent formal character that it is impossible to tell an early work from a late one without specialist knowledge of the period conventions. While it is true that Egyptian art maintained a remarkable degree of formal consistency across a very long period, a consistency that was itself a deliberate cultural choice rather than a failure of imagination, there were, in fact, significant variations in style, technique, and aesthetic approach across different periods and different regions of Egyptian civilization, and specialists can identify not only the period, but often the specific workshop and even the individual hand responsible for specific works. The apparent uniformity of Egyptian art reflects the success of a cultural system designed to maintain formal consistency as a deliberate ideological choice, not the absence of artistic individuality or development within that system. Many people believe that Michelangelo was a deeply religious man whose faith was uncomplicated and conventional, a devout Catholic who produced his great religious works from a position of straightforward orthodox belief that gave the paintings and sculptures their spiritual power. The historical record suggests a considerably more complex picture. Michelangelo's faith was intense and searching, but frequently troubled by doubt, by fear of divine judgment, and by associations with reform movements within the Catholic Church, particularly the Spirituali, whose ideas about a more personal and scripturally grounded faith were regarded with suspicion by the more conservative elements of the institutional church. His late poetry is filled with expressions of spiritual anxiety and self-doubt that are entirely inconsistent with a simple orthodox faith. And several scholars have argued that the increasingly dark and troubled quality of his late work reflects a genuine religious crisis rather than a straightforward expression of conventional Catholic devotion. His faith was real, but it was not simple. It is widely believed that the Louvre in Paris was always intended to be a museum, that the building was designed and constructed from the beginning as a public institution for the display of art to the citizens of France. The Louvre was in fact a royal palace for several centuries before it became a museum, serving as the primary residence of French kings from the medieval period through the reign of Louis XIV, who moved the court to Versailles in 1682. The transformation of the palace into a public museum was a deliberate political act of the French Revolution, implemented in 1793 as an expression of the revolutionary principle that art and culture that had previously belonged exclusively to the monarchy should now belong to the people. The building's transformation from an instrument of royal power into a public institution of culture reflects a fundamental shift in the political philosophy of cultural ownership rather than a continuous institutional intention. There is a common belief that Rembrandt was forgotten almost immediately after his death, and that his reputation was entirely obscure for the century and a half following 1669, only being rediscovered by the Romantics in the early 19th century, who recognized his genius for the first time. While it is true that Rembrandt's reputation declined significantly in the final decades of his life, and that his late style was criticized by contemporary observers who found it too rough and too unconventional, he was never entirely forgotten, and his work continued to be collected, discussed, and admired by connoisseurs throughout the 18th century. The Romantic period did see a significant reassessment and intensification of his reputation, particularly in France, where Delacroix and other Romantic painters championed his work as a model of emotional expressiveness and painterly freedom. But this reassessment built on a continuous, if diminished, tradition of appreciation rather than representing a rediscovery from complete obscurity. Many people believe that the term Baroque, which is used to describe the dramatic, theatrically intense art and architecture of the 17th century, was coined as a term of praise by the contemporaries of Bernini, Caravaggio, and Rubens, who recognized in their work a magnificent new style worthy of a distinctive name. The term Baroque was in fact originally used as a term of contempt by neoclassical critics of the 18th century, who found the emotional excess, theatrical complexity, and formal exuberance of 17th century art antithetical to the rational clarity and formal restraint that they associated with the classical ideal. The word appears to derive either from a Portuguese term for an irregularly shaped pearl, or from a term used in medieval logic for a particularly convoluted form of argument, and in both cases, the implication was of something irregular, excessive, and unnecessarily complicated. The rehabilitation of the Baroque, as a term of positive critical description, was a gradual process that extended across the 19th and 20th centuries. It is commonly believed that the great Renaissance patron Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, was primarily a political figure who supported the arts as a form of dynastic self-promotion rather than out of any genuine personal interest in or understanding of the art and literature he commissioned and collected. Contemporary accounts of Lorenzo suggest a man of genuine and deep intellectual engagement with the humanist culture of his court, who participated actively in the philosophical debates of the Platonic Academy he supported, who wrote poetry of real quality that has been valued by literary scholars independently of its political context, and whose specific choices in commissioning and collecting art reflected a personal, aesthetic sensibility rather than simply a political calculation. His relationship with the young Michelangelo, whom he took into his household and educated alongside his own children, reflects a quality of personal artistic engagement that goes well beyond the instrumental patronage model. Many people believe that Andy Warhol's famous Campbell's Soup Cans series, produced in 1962, was an immediate and unambiguous commercial and critical success that launched his career as a pop art figure without any significant resistance or controversy. The work's reception was in fact deeply divided, with many critics finding it either a trivial novelty or a cynical provocation that had nothing to do with serious art. The first exhibition of the Campbell's Soup Cans at the Ferus Gallery in Los Angeles in 1962 was treated by many visitors as a joke, and the gallery owner had to explain repeatedly to confused viewers that the paintings were intended as serious works of art. A neighboring gallery responded to the exhibition by displaying actual cans of Campbell's soup in their window with a sign offering them for sale at a fraction of the price of Warhol's paintings. The subsequent acceptance of pop art as a major movement in the history of 20th century art was a gradual process rather than an immediate recognition. There is a popular belief that Paul Gauguin left Paris for Tahiti in 1891 in search of an unspoiled paradise of natural beauty and indigenous authenticity that existed in radical contrast to the corrupt and exhausted, the civilization of 19th century Europe, and that he found what he was looking for in the Polynesian island. The reality of Gauguin's Tahitian experience was considerably more complicated and considerably less idyllic than this narrative suggests. Tahiti in 1891 was already significantly transformed by European colonization and Christian missionary activity, and the Polynesian culture that Gauguin depicted in his paintings was to a significant extent an idealized reconstruction based on his reading of earlier accounts of the island rather than a direct observation of a living indigenous culture. Many of the images he produced were staged rather than observed, and the women he painted were frequently not the inhabitants of an unspoiled paradise, but members of a colonial society already deeply affected by the European presence he had ostensibly traveled to escape. Most people believe that the term masterpiece originally referred to a work of exceptional artistic quality, a painter's or sculptor's finest achievement, and has always carried the connotation of supreme artistic excellence that it carries in contemporary usage. The word masterpiece originally had a much more specific and much more prosaic technical meaning, referring to the work that an apprentice craftsman was required to produce to demonstrate his competence and gain admission to a craft guild as a full member. The masterpiece, in this original sense, was not necessarily a work of exceptional quality, but a demonstration of standard professional competence, and the elevation of the term to its current meaning of supreme artistic excellence was a gradual development that reflected the changing status of the visual arts from craft to fine art across the Renaissance and subsequent periods. The word's original meaning gives a very different picture of the social and institutional context within which great works of art were produced. It is widely believed that Caravaggio's revolutionary use of darkness and dramatic lighting, the technique that critics later called tenebrism, was entirely his own invention, a formal approach that had no precedent in the Italian painting tradition before him. While Caravaggio's application of tenebrism was more extreme and more consistent than anything that had preceded it, he was working within a tradition of interest in artificial light and dramatic shadow that had been explored before him by northern Italian painters, including Giovanni Girolamo Savoldo, Lorenzo Lotto, and Moretto de Brescia, and his time in Rome gave him access to the works of these painters as well as to the growing influence of the Flemish tradition of candlelit nocturnal scenes. His achievement was to push these existing tendencies to a new extreme of dramatic contrast and to apply them with a consistency and a formal rigor that transformed them from occasional effects into a systematic approach to the representation of the visible world. But the idea of a completely unprecedented invention misrepresents the degree to which his work grew from an existing tradition. Many people believe that the great Dutch Golden Age painters of the 17th century, Rembrandt, Vermeer, Frans Hals, Jan Steen, worked in a thriving and well-supported artistic community whose commercial success and professional security reflected the broader prosperity of the Dutch Republic during its golden age. The commercial realities of being a professional painter in 17th century Holland were in fact considerably less secure than this picture suggests. The Dutch art market was highly competitive, subject to significant fluctuations in demand, and organized in ways that made it difficult for even talented painters to achieve consistent financial stability. Rembrandt died in poverty, Vermeer left his wife and 11 children in debt, and Frans Hals spent his final years receiving charity from the Haarlem Municipal Poorhouse. The prosperity of the Dutch Republic created a large market for paintings, but the competition among the many painters seeking to serve that market meant that the financial rewards for individual artists were often modest and frequently unreliable. There is a widespread belief that Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, the celebrated drawing of a male figure inscribed in a circle and a square, was an entirely original composition that Leonardo invented as a means of illustrating his own theory of human proportion. The drawing was in fact Leonardo's interpretation of a description of ideal human proportion given by the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius in his treatise on architecture, and Leonardo was one of several Renaissance artists and scholars who attempted to produce visual interpretations of Vitruvius's description during the same period. His contemporary Francesco di Giorgio Martini produced a similar drawing, as did the Venetian monk Fra Giocondo, and the comparison between the different interpretations of the same text by different artists gives a picture of the collaborative and competitive intellectual culture of Renaissance humanism that the canonical status of Leonardo's version tends to obscure. Leonardo's drawing is the finest of the various interpretations, but it was not a solitary invention. Most people believe that the term fine art refers to a clear and universally agreed distinction between art objects of the highest cultural value and the decorative or applied arts of lesser status, a distinction that has always been central to the organization of artistic culture in Western civilization. The distinction between fine art and decorative or applied art is in fact a relatively recent historical construction that emerged primarily in the 18th century, and that reflects the specific social and philosophical assumptions Enlightenment culture rather than any natural or universal hierarchy of artistic value. In earlier periods of Western art history and in most non-Western artistic traditions, the distinction between fine art and craft was either non-existent or organized along entirely different lines, and many of the objects now most highly valued by the art market and the museum system, ancient Greek vases, medieval tapestries, Renaissance goldsmith work, were produced within traditions that did not recognize the distinction that modern institutional culture imposes on them. It is commonly believed that Raphael was a gentle and uncomplicated personality whose serene and harmonious paintings reflected a life of artistic happiness and personal contentment, untroubled by the conflicts and difficulties that marked the careers of his more obviously dramatic contemporaries. The historical record suggests a more complex figure, a man of considerable social and professional ambition, whose relationships with his various patrons and collaborators were not always harmonious, whose management of a large and productive workshop required significant organizational and interpersonal skills that went well beyond the gentle artistic temperament of popular legend, and whose love life was apparently complicated enough to have attracted contemporary comment. The smoothness and harmony of his paintings reflect an artistic achievement of the highest order, but they do not necessarily mirror the personal qualities of the man who made them, and the tendency to read the qualities of an artist's work directly into their personality is one of the most persistent and most misleading habits in the reception of art. Many people believe that the Elgin marbles were illegally stolen from the Parthenon by Lord Elgin, who removed them without any authorization from the Ottoman authorities, who controlled Athens at the time, and in clear violation of the law. The legal status of Elgin's removal of the sculptures is in fact genuinely disputed and considerably more complex than the simple narrative of theft suggests. Elgin obtained a firman, a written authorization from the Ottoman authorities, that permitted him to remove sculptures from the Acropolis, and while the precise terms of this document and the degree to which it authorized the specific removals he carried out have been debated by legal scholars and historians for more than 2 centuries, the removal was not clandestine or clearly illegal by the standards of the time. The moral and cultural arguments for the sculpture's return to Athens are genuine and powerful, but they are distinct from the legal question, and the conflation of the moral and legal arguments in popular accounts tends to obscure the genuine complexity of both. There is a common belief that Georges Seurat developed pointillism, the technique of applying paint in small dots of pure color as a purely intuitive artistic discovery, a new way of painting that he arrived at through direct artistic experimentation rather than through the application of scientific theory. Seurat was in fact deeply and systematically influenced by the scientific color theories of writers including Michel-Eugène Chevreuil, Ogden Roud, and Charles Blanc, whose work on the optical mixture of colors and the effects of simultaneous contrast provided the theoretical foundation for his painting technique. He approached painting with an almost scientific rigor, applying the theoretical principles of color science to the practical problems of picture making in a way that was explicitly and deliberately systematic rather than intuitive, and his notebooks and correspondence reflect a sustained engagement with the scientific literature on color perception that was fundamental to the development of his method. The idea of the purely intuitive artist and the systematic scientist are both simplifications that the historical record does not support. Most people believe that the famous painting of Napoleon crossing the Alps, produced by Jacques-Louis David in 1801 and showing the French general on a rearing horse dramatically gesturing toward the mountain pass he is about to cross, is an accurate historical record of how Napoleon actually made the crossing. The painting is an almost entirely idealized fiction. Napoleon crossed the Alps in the spring of 1800 on a mule rather than a horse, dressed in practical traveling clothes rather than the dramatic military uniform David depicts, and without the theatrical gesture of command that gives the painting its dynamic composition. When told about the painting, Napoleon himself reportedly said that he wanted to be shown calm on a fiery horse, suggesting that he understood and approved of the propagandistic idealization rather than expecting historical accuracy. The painting is one of the most celebrated examples of political portraiture as deliberate myth-making rather than documentary record. It is widely believed that the cave paintings at Lascaux in southern France and other prehistoric cave sites were made by primitive peoples with a limited understanding of the world around them. Simple images, produced by minds not yet capable of the sophisticated cognitive processes that distinguish fully modern human consciousness. The cave paintings at Lascaux, produced approximately 17,000 years ago, and the even earlier paintings at Chauvet, produced approximately 36,000 years ago, demonstrate a level of artistic sophistication in the representation of animal movement, the use of perspective and foreshortening, the exploitation of the natural contours of the cave walls to give three-dimensional form to the depicted animals that is entirely inconsistent with any model of limited cognitive capacity. The people who made these paintings were anatomically and cognitively modern humans whose intellectual capacities were indistinguishable from those of any person living today, and the sophistication of their art reflects the full range of human creative intelligence rather than its early and limited beginnings. Many people believe that art forgery is primarily a modern phenomenon made possible by the development of sophisticated techniques for artificially aging materials and creating false provenance documentation, and that the art of earlier periods was largely free from the problem of deliberately deceptive fakes. Art forgery has in fact been a significant problem throughout the history of Western art, with documented examples of deliberate fakes going back to ancient Rome, where copies of celebrated Greek sculptures were sold to Roman collectors as originals, and where ancient texts record complaints about the prevalence of forgery in the art market. The Renaissance saw the systematic production of works in the style of celebrated earlier artists that were intended to deceive, and Michelangelo himself is said to have produced a sleeping Cupid in the antique style that was sold as a genuine ancient work early in his career. The specific techniques of modern forgery are new, but the fundamental practice of producing deceptive fakes for financial gain is as old as the art market itself. There is a popular belief that the Impressionist painter Edouard Manet was himself an Impressionist who exhibited with the Impressionist group and shared their commitment to plein-air painting and the systematic investigation of light and atmosphere in the natural landscape. Manet never exhibited with the Impressionist group and consistently declined invitations to do so, preferring to seek recognition through the official salon rather than through the independent exhibitions that his younger colleagues organized. While his work was enormously influential on the development of Impressionism, and while he was personally close to several of the Impressionist painters, particularly Monet, Berthe Morisot, and Edgar Degas, his own painting was different in important respects from the Impressionist approach, maintaining a stronger emphasis on the flat surface and the strong outline, and showing less systematic interest in the depiction of outdoor light than the work of the painters with whom he is most commonly associated. The confusion between Manet and Monet, whose names are almost identical, has contributed to the blurring of the distinction between two very different artistic personalities. Most people believe that the great museums of the world, the British Museum, the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, were established from the beginning as public institutions devoted to the education and enrichment of all citizens, regardless of their social background, democratic institutions that embodied the Enlightenment ideal of universal access to knowledge and culture. The history of most of the world's great museums reveals a considerably more complicated relationship with the ideal of universal public access. The British Museum was founded in 1753, but for its first century of existence required visitors to apply in advance for admission tickets and was effectively accessible only to the educated middle and upper classes. The Louvre's democratic founding principles did not prevent it from being effectively inaccessible to many of the people whose cultural heritage it claimed to represent. The transformation of museums from institutions primarily serving educated elites into genuinely public spaces accessible to all was a gradual process that extended across the 19th and 20th centuries, and that is, in some respects, still incomplete. It is commonly believed that the term avant-garde in art has always referred to the most formally radical and most technically experimental art being produced at any given moment, with the implication that the most innovative and the most challenging art is automatically the most advanced and the most valuable. The term avant-garde was borrowed from military vocabulary. In French, it literally means advance guard, the troops sent ahead of the main army to scout and engage the enemy, and its application to art was always metaphorical rather than descriptive of any inherent quality of the works it designated. The association between formal radicalism and cultural value that the term implies reflects a specific historical moment in the development of modernist art criticism rather than a universal truth about artistic significance. And the degree to which formally conservative or traditional art can be of the highest quality is demonstrated by the example of numerous major 20th century artists, Lucian Freud, Andrew Wyeth, Balthus, whose work developed outside the mainstream of formal experimentation without any diminution of its significance or its depth. Many people believe that Frida Kahlo's husband, Diego Rivera, was consistently supportive of her painting career, and that their relationship, however turbulent personally, was one of mutual artistic encouragement and professional respect. The relationship between Kahlo and Rivera was considerably more complicated in its artistic dimensions than this picture suggests. Rivera was frequently dismissive of her painting in company, describing it as minor work by comparison with the grand public ambitions of his own murals, and the specific kinds of support he offered her career were often entangled with his own aesthetic preferences and professional judgments in ways that served his interests as much as hers. The systematic promotion of her work that eventually led to her international recognition owed as much to her own determined self-advocacy and to the enthusiasm of specific patrons and dealers as it did to Rivera's support, and the popular image of Rivera as the constant champion of his wife's career misrepresents the genuine complexity of the artistic dynamic between them. There is a widespread belief that the abstract expressionist movement in post-war American painting was a purely organic cultural development that emerged spontaneously from the specific social and artistic conditions of post-war New York, without any external influence or institutional support. Recent historical research has revealed that the abstract expressionist movement received significant support from the Central Intelligence Agency during the Cold War period, which promoted American abstract art in Europe as evidence of the cultural vitality and creative freedom of the United States, in contrast to the socialist realism mandated by the Soviet state. The CIA's cultural program, operating through front organizations including the Congress for Cultural Freedom, funded exhibitions, publications, and cultural events that promoted abstract expressionism internationally, making the movement partly a product of Cold War cultural politics as well as an authentic artistic development. The revelation of this support, which became public in the 1970s, has generated sustained debate about the relationship between artistic authenticity and political instrumentalization. Many people believe that the great Renaissance sculptor Donatello was a solitary artistic genius who worked alone and developed his revolutionary approach to sculpture through purely individual creative investigation without significant artistic collaboration or creative exchange with other artists of his generation. Donatello, in fact, worked in close creative collaboration with the architect Filippo Brunelleschi for extended periods during the early decades of the 15th century, and the two men's shared investigation of the principles of linear perspective and their mutual engagement with the study of ancient Roman art and architecture were fundamental to the development of both men's mature achievements. The young Michelangelo, who studied the ancient sculptures in the Medici collection that Donatello had helped to form, was in this sense as much a descendant of the collaborative culture of early Florentine humanism as he was of any individual artistic predecessor, and the isolation of individual genius from the collaborative culture that surrounds and shapes it is one of the most persistent distortions in the popular history of art. It is widely believed that Vincent van Gogh's painting style, the thick impasto, the swirling brushwork, the intense color was the result of his mental illness, and that the specific formal qualities of his mature work were a direct expression of psychological disturbance that would not have been possible in a state of mental health. The relationship between Van Gogh's illness and his painting is considerably more complex than this simple equation suggests. His periods of mental crisis were in fact periods during which he was frequently unable to paint at all, and the most celebrated and most formally intense works of his Arles and Saint-Rémy periods were produced during the intervals of relative clarity between episodes of illness, rather than during the episodes themselves. The formal qualities of his mature style were the product of conscious artistic development across years of sustained practice, drawing on specific influences including Japanese woodblock prints, the Impressionist painters he encountered in Paris, and his own progressive investigation of the expressive possibilities of color and brushwork, rather than the involuntary expression of a disturbed mental state. There is a common belief that the sculptor Auguste Rodin was an immediately celebrated artist, whose work was recognized from the very beginning of his career as revolutionary, and whose major sculptures were received with universal enthusiasm when they were first exhibited. Rodin's early career was marked by significant resistance and hostility from the French artistic establishment, and his most celebrated works were initially received with considerable controversy. His sculpture, The Age of Bronze, first exhibited in 1877, was so naturalistically rendered that the jury of the Paris Salon accused him of having cast it directly from a living model rather than having sculpted it, an accusation of fraudulent practice that he was required to spend considerable effort disproving. His commission for The Gates of Hell, begun in 1880, occupied him for the rest of his life, and was never completed in a form he considered finished. The image of immediate and universal recognition misrepresents a career that achieved its eventual canonical status through sustained effort against significant institutional resistance. Many people believe that the art of ancient China was always organized around the same aesthetic values and the same formal conventions that characterize the Chinese art most familiar to Western audiences, the landscape, painting, the calligraphy, the decorative ceramics, and that these traditions represent the essential and unchanging nature of Chinese artistic culture across thousands of years. Chinese art across its long history encompasses an extraordinary range of styles, media, techniques, and aesthetic values that are as varied as the art of any other major civilization, and the specific traditions that have become most familiar to Western audiences represent only a small portion of this diversity. The emphasis on landscape painting as the highest form of Chinese art reflects the values of a specific period, the Song dynasty and after, and a specific class, the educated literati, rather than the universal values of Chinese artistic culture as a whole. Earlier periods produced art of very different characters, and the diversity of Chinese artistic production across 4,000 years of continuous civilization is vastly greater than the simplified image of a single unified tradition suggests. It is commonly believed that the Florentine painter Sandro Botticelli was recognized throughout his career as one of the greatest painters of his generation, and that his reputation never significantly declined during his lifetime or in the painter. Immediate centuries following his death, Botticelli's reputation, in fact, declined very sharply in the final years of his life, influenced by the religious revival associated with the preacher Girolamo Savonarola and by the broader shift in artistic taste toward the monumental grandeur of the High Renaissance that his more linear and decorative style could not accommodate. He produced relatively little work in the last 2 decades of his life and died in 1510, in a state of obscurity that would have been unrecognizable to anyone familiar with his position at the height of Medici patronage in the proof 1480s. His rediscovery in the 19th century by the Pre-Raphaelites and the critic John Ruskin transformed him from a largely forgotten historical figure into one of the most celebrated painters of the Renaissance, but this rediscovery was a genuine recovery from genuine obscurity rather than a continuation of a continuous tradition of recognition. Many people believe that the art market operates as a straightforward meritocracy in which the prices paid for works of art reflect their inherent artistic quality and their importance in the history of art, so that the most expensive works are necessarily also the most artistically significant. The art market is in fact shaped by a complex combination of factors, including the fame of the artist's name, the provenance and exhibition history of individual works, the specific tastes of the collectors who are most active in the market at any given moment, the marketing activities of dealers and auction houses, and the broader economic conditions that affect the supply of investment capital available for luxury purchases. The correlation between price and artistic quality is loose at best and frequently entirely absent. Some of the most expensive works sold at auction in recent decades are by artists whose historical significance is modest, while some of the most important works in the history of art are held by institutions that would never sell them and have no commercial value in any meaningful sense. The conflation of financial and artistic value is one of the most persistent and most misleading assumptions in popular thinking about art. There is a popular belief that Paul Cézanne was entirely self-taught, and that his distinctive approach to painting its structural solidity, its systematic investigation of form and color, emerged independently of any significant engagement with the work of earlier artists or any formal artistic training. Cézanne, in fact, studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Aix-en-Provence and subsequently in Paris, where he had extensive access to the masterworks of the Louvre and engaged seriously and systematically with the work of earlier painters, including Delacroix, Courbet, and the Venetian colorist. His early work shows clear evidence of these influences, and his mature style developed through a sustained dialogue with the painting tradition rather than in isolation from it. He famously said that he wanted to redo Poussin from nature, to combine the classical, structural order of the French academic tradition with the directness of observation of the Impressionists, a formulation that places his work explicitly in relationship to a tradition rather than in opposition to all precedent. Most people believe that the famous image of the American Gothic by Grant Wood, painted in 1930 and showing a stern-faced farmer and a woman standing in front of a house with a Gothic window, depicts a husband and wife, an elderly farming couple whose austere expressions capture something essential about the severity of Midwestern American rural life. The two figures in the painting were not intended by Grant Wood to represent a married couple, but a father and his daughter. The models were Wood's sister Nan Wood Graham and his dentist Dr. Byron McKeeby, and the relationship Wood intended to depict was generational rather than conjugal. The widespread misidentification of the relationship between the two figures reflects the tendency of viewers to project their own assumptions about domestic arrangements onto images that do not specify them, and Nan Wood Graham spent much of her life correcting the misapprehension while expressing considerable irritation at being permanently identified as someone's wife rather than someone's daughter. It is widely believed that the Renaissance was a period of sudden and dramatic cultural rebirth in which the achievements of ancient Greece and Rome were rediscovered after a period of complete cultural darkness during the Middle Ages, and that the Middle Ages produced nothing of significant cultural or artistic value. The Renaissance humanists, who coined the concept of the Middle Ages as a period of darkness between two periods of classical illumination, were engaged in a deliberate act of cultural self-promotion rather than accurate historical description, and the idea of the medieval period as culturally barren has been thoroughly discredited by modern scholarship. Medieval Europe produced extraordinary artistic achievements, including the great Gothic cathedrals, the Romanesque churches, the illuminated manuscripts, the tapestries, and the panel paintings of the late medieval period that represent some of the finest works in the history of Western art. The Renaissance was a period of genuine cultural transformation, but it built on medieval foundations rather than recovering from medieval darkness. Many people believe that Jackson Pollock was the first artist to pour or drip paint onto a canvas laid on the floor, and that his development of the drip technique in the late 1940s was a completely unprecedented formal innovation without any precedent in the history of art. Several artists had used pouring and dripping techniques before Pollock, including the surrealist painter Max Ernst, who developed the technique of oscillation, swinging a can of paint with a hole in the bottom over a canvas to create unpredictable dripped lines in the early 1940s, and the Mexican muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros, who organized a workshop in New York in 1936, at which experimental techniques, including the pouring of paint onto horizontal surfaces, were explored, and which Pollock is believed to have attended. What Pollock contributed was not the technique itself, but a new systematic and sustained application of it as the primary means of creating large-scale compositions of extraordinary formal complexity and emotional intensity, and the transformation of the technique from an experimental curiosity into a fully realized artistic language was his specific achievement. There is a common belief that Michelangelo's famous sculpture, the Pieta in St. Peter's Basilica, showing the Virgin Mary holding the body of the dead Christ, was universally admired from the moment of its position, installation, and that its status as one of the greatest sculptures ever made has never been seriously questioned. While the Pietà has been celebrated since its installation in the late 1500s, the specific reception of the work in the years immediately following its completion included at least one prominent criticism that the Virgin Mary appeared too young to be the mother of a 33-year-old man, an observation that Michelangelo is said to have addressed by arguing that the Virgin's perpetual chastity had preserved her from the aging effects that sin produced in ordinary mortals, a theological justification that not everyone found entirely convincing. The sculpture was also attacked in 1972 by a mentally disturbed man who struck it with a hammer, damaging the Virgin's nose and arm and requiring an extensive restoration, after which the work was placed behind protective glass that has somewhat altered the experience of viewing it in the basilica. Most people believe that the Impressionist painter Edgar Degas was primarily a painter of ballet dancers, and that his depictions of rehearsals, performances, and backstage moments in the Paris Opera constitute the essential core of his artistic achievement and the work for which he will primarily be remembered. While the ballet subjects are certainly among Degas' most celebrated and most immediately recognizable works, they represent only one strand of an output that was considerably more varied and more formally experimental than the image of the ballet painter suggests. He produced extraordinary work in the depiction of horse racing, cafe scenes, laundresses, milliners, and bathers, and his experiments with pastel, monotype, and sculpture give his output a technical range that the emphasis on the ballet pictures tends to obscure. He was also one of the most dedicated and most technically sophisticated printmakers of his generation, and his prints, particularly his etchings and monotypes, represent an aspect of his achievement that has received considerably less public attention than the paintings and pastels, despite their very high quality. It is commonly believed that the Baroque sculptor and architect Gian Lorenzo Bernini always enjoyed uninterrupted papal support throughout his career, and that his relationship with the succession of popes, who were his primary patrons, was consistently harmonious and productive. Bernini experienced a significant period of official disfavor following the death of his great patron, Pope Urban VIII, in 1644, when the new pope, Innocent X, who was personally hostile to Bernini and to the Barberini family, whose patronage had defined his career effectively, excluded him from major papal commissions for a period of several years. The failure of the twin bell towers he had designed for the facade of St. Peter's Basilica, which had to be demolished after causing structural damage to the building, provided his enemies with ammunition that threatened to end his dominance of Roman artistic life. It was the extraordinary success of the Fountain of the Four Rivers, commissioned by Innocent despite his personal reservations, that rehabilitated his position and restored him to papal favor. Many people believe that the art of the Renaissance was primarily concerned with the celebration of the human body and the assertion of human dignity and human potential against the otherworldly spirituality of medieval Christianity, reflecting a fundamental shift from theocentric to anthropocentric values. The relationship between Renaissance art and Christian spirituality was in fact considerably more complex than this simple contrast suggests, and the vast majority of Renaissance art was produced for explicitly religious purposes and reflects genuine and deeply felt religious conviction, rather than a secular humanism opposed to Christianity. The humanist celebration of human dignity and human potential was understood by Renaissance thinkers not as an alternative to Christian spirituality, but as an expression of it, a recognition of the special dignity that God had, conferred on human beings by creating them in his own image. The secularization of Renaissance humanism that the popular narrative assumes is a retrospective construction that reflects the values of later periods rather than the self-understanding of the Renaissance itself. There is a widespread belief that Vincent van Gogh sold only one painting during his entire lifetime, a fact that is regularly cited as the supreme example of the misunderstood genius whose work was entirely unrecognized by his contemporaries. While it is true that Van Gogh sold only one painting, The Red Vineyard, sold in Brussels in 1890 for 400 Belgian francs during his 10-year painting career, the claim that his work was entirely unrecognized by his contemporaries significantly misrepresents his actual situation. He received genuine critical attention from the French art critic Albert Aurier, who published an enthusiastic review of his work in January 1890, just months before his death. His paintings were shown in several group exhibitions where they attracted genuine interest from other artists and some collectors, and his brother Theo, who provided his financial support throughout his career, was an art dealer who was actively attempting to place his work with collectors in the final years of his life. The complete misrecognition of the popular myth was a partial misrecognition in reality. Most people believe that the term chiaroscuro, the Italian word for the use of strong contrasts between light and dark in painting, was invented by or is primarily associated with Caravaggio, whose revolutionary use of extreme light-dark contrast made it the defining technical feature of his style. The term chiaroscuro was in widespread use among Italian artists and writers before Caravaggio was born, and the technique it described was central to the painting of Leonardo da Vinci, who wrote extensively about the theory of light and shadow, and whose sfumato technique represents one of the most sophisticated applications of chiaroscuro in the history of painting. The technique was also fundamental to the work of Raphael and the Venetian painters of the 16th century, and the idea that it was Caravaggio's invention reflects the tendency to associate a technique most strongly with the artist who used it most dramatically, rather than with those who developed it or applied it with equal sophistication, in less extreme form. It is widely believed that the Pre-Raphaelites took their name from a general admiration for all art produced before Raphael, reflecting a broad commitment to the values of medieval and early Renaissance art, against the academic tradition descended from Raphael's example. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood actually had a more specific and more limited target in mind when they chose their name. They were primarily reacting against what they perceived as the mechanical application of the formal conventions associated with Raphael's mature style that dominated the teaching of the Royal Academy in London in the 1840s, rather than against Raphael himself or against the entire tradition of art that his example had generated. Several of the Pre-Raphaelites had considerable admiration for Raphael's early work, and were less dismissive of the Italian Renaissance tradition as a whole than their name might suggest. The name was partly a deliberate provocation intended to signal their rejection of the academic establishment, rather than a precisely accurate description of their aesthetic commitments. Many people believe that the great Flemish painter Peter Paul Rubens was primarily an artist, and that his diplomatic career, his service as an ambassador for the Spanish crown in the courts of England and France, was a secondary activity that interrupted and distracted from his primary vocation as a painter. Rubens himself appears to have regarded his diplomatic career as at least equally important to his painting in terms of its significance for the world, and the historical evidence suggests that his involvement in the political negotiations he undertook was genuine and substantive, rather than a cover for intelligence gathering or a purely ceremonial role. He negotiated the peace between England and Spain in the late 1620s in a process that required sustained political intelligence and diplomatic skill, and his letters from this period show a man deeply engaged with the substance of the political issues at stake, rather than simply a painter playing at diplomacy. The separation of his artistic and diplomatic identities into a primary and a secondary career reflects modern assumptions about the incompatibility of artistic and political life that did not apply in the same way to the culture of early 17th century Europe. There is a popular belief that the cave paintings of Lascaux were discovered by a group of French schoolboys in 1940 who stumbled upon the cave entrance by accident while playing in the countryside near Montignac, a charmingly accidental discovery story that has become one of the most frequently repeated anecdotes in the history of archaeology. The discovery was indeed made by young people rather than professional archaeologists, and it did involve some degree of accident, but the specific details of the popular account are not entirely accurate. The cave was found by 4 teenagers, Marcel Ravidat, Jacques Marsal, Georges Agnel, and Simon Coenkers, on the 12th of September 1940, and the discovery followed a dog that had fallen into a hole rather than a purely accidental stumbling upon an entrance. The subsequent recognition of the painting's significance and their reporting to the appropriate authorities was handled responsibly and promptly, and the cave was brought to the attention of the prehistorian Henri Breuil within days of its discovery, leading to its rapid scientific investigation and eventual public recognition as one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Most people believe that Vermeer's famous painting Girl with a Pearl Earring depicts a specific historical individual whose identity has been established or can be established through historical research, in the same way that portraits by Rembrandt or Van Dyck can be identified with specific named individuals through documentary evidence. There is in fact no historical documentation of the identity of the girl depicted in the painting, and the work is not a portrait in the conventional sense. It is a trony, a Dutch genre term for a study of a face or head type that was not intended to record the likeness of a specific named individual. The specific identity of the model, if the painting was based on a real person, is entirely unknown and is likely to remain so. The novel by Tracy Chevalier, published in 1999, which imagined the girl as a fictional servant in Vermeer's household named Grie, has contributed significantly to the popular assumption that the painting depicts a specific identifiable person, but the novel's premise was a fictional invention rather than a historical conclusion. It is commonly believed that the great Spanish painter Francisco Goya was always the kind of artist he became in his later years: dark, nightmarish, politically engaged, and formally experimental, and that the black paintings and the disasters of war represent the consistent expression of a sensibility that was always oriented toward darkness and psychological extremity. Goya's early career was characterized by a very different kind of painting: decorative tapestry cartoons of charming and colorful scenes of Spanish popular life, official portraits of the Spanish royal family and aristocracy, and religious works that showed no particular tendency toward the darkness of his later output. The transformation of his artistic vision appears to have been driven by specific historical events: his near-fatal illness in 1792 that left him permanently deaf, his experience of the French invasion of Spain in 1808 and the atrocities of the subsequent Peninsular War, and his political disillusionment with the restored Bourbon monarchy, rather than by a sensibility that was always oriented toward darkness. The late work is not the expression of a consistent personality, but the transformation of one. Many people believe that the famous sculpture, the discus thrower, the ancient Greek figure of an athlete in the act of throwing a discus, is a Greek original whose survival represents one of the rare cases in which an actual ancient Greek bronze has been preserved across more than 2,000 years without being melted down or lost. The discus thrower that is displayed in museums around the world is in fact a Roman marble copy of a lost Greek bronze original attributed to the sculptor Myron and produced around 450 before the Common Era. No ancient Greek original of the work survives, and the copies of which several exist in different collections vary significantly in their details in ways that reflect the different Roman copyists' interpretations of the original rather than any consistent fidelity to it. The idea that the ancient sculptures displayed in the world's great museums are Greek originals is a widespread misconception. The vast majority are Roman copies, and the number of surviving original Greek bronzes and marbles is very small relative to the enormous quantity of ancient sculpture that has been lost. It is widely believed that the art of the Renaissance was primarily produced in Florence and Rome, and that the rest of Italy, Venice, Milan, Bologna, Naples played a secondary role in the cultural transformation of the period. Venice, in particular, was the site of artistic developments of the highest significance that were, in many respects, as important to the subsequent history of Western painting as anything produced in Florence or Rome, and the Venetian tradition of colorism, the systematic investigation of the expressive possibilities of color as distinct from line and form, developed by Giovanni Bellini, Giorgione, Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese, was one of the most consequential contributions to the history of painting made in any period. The influence of the Venetian colorist tradition on Rubens, Velázquez, Rembrandt, and ultimately on the entire subsequent development of European painting was at least as significant as the influence of the Florentine and Roman traditions that dominate the popular narrative of the Renaissance. There is a common belief that Salvador Dalí was a committed surrealist who remained loyal to the movement and its ideals throughout his career, and that his eventual expulsion from the Surrealist group by André Breton was a political dispute that had nothing to do with any genuine divergence in artistic values. The break between Dalí and the Surrealist group, which became definitive in the late 1930s, reflected genuine differences in political and artistic values rather than simply a personal dispute. Dalí's flirtation with fascism and his admiration for Hitler, which he expressed publicly, and which Breton and the other surrealists, who were predominantly committed to left-wing politics, found intolerable, was the primary cause of his expulsion, and his subsequent career, which moved increasingly toward commercial self-promotion and away from the serious artistic investigation that had characterized his best surrealist work, reflected a genuine shift in priorities that the other members of the group were right to identify as a departure from the movement's core commitments. Breton's anagrammatic nickname for Dalí a vida dollars, an anagram of his name, captured the nature of the divergence with characteristic acerbity. Many people believe that the ancient Roman Colosseum was built by the Romans as a place of entertainment for the general population, a democratic institution where all citizens, regardless of their social status, could gather to watch gladiatorial combat and other spectacles free of charge. The Colosseum was, in fact, a highly stratified social space in which seating was allocated strictly according to social rank, with the emperor and the Vestal Virgins occupying the most privileged positions closest to the arena floor, followed by senators, equestrians, and ordinary citizens in descending order of proximity to the action. While admission was free, the spectacles were provided by emperors and wealthy patrons as a form of political patronage and social control, rather than as a commercial entertainment. The experience of attending the games was entirely different depending on one's social position, and the architecture of the building was designed to enforce and make visible the social hierarchy it contained. The democratic institution of popular legend was in reality a carefully engineered instrument of social stratification. It is commonly believed that the painter El Greco, the Greek-born artist who worked in Toledo, Spain in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, used the distinctive elongated, distorted figures and intensely spiritual quality that characterize his mature style throughout his entire career, as if these qualities were innate to his artistic personality from the beginning. El Greco's early work, produced during his training in Crete in the Byzantine icon painting tradition, and subsequently during his years in Venice and Rome, was entirely different in character from his mature Spanish style, more conventional in its figural proportions, more indebted to the specific traditions of Byzantine icon painting and Italian Renaissance painting, within which he was trained, and showing no particular tendency toward the dramatic elongation and spiritual intensity that his Toledo work displays. The specific qualities of his mature style appear to have developed in response to the specific religious culture of Counter-Reformation Spain and the particular demands of the Toledan patrons for whom he worked, rather than being a consistent expression of a personal aesthetic that was present from the beginning of his career. Many people believe that the famous Elgin marbles controversy began with the formation of the modern Greek state in the 19th century and has been a consistent and uninterrupted debate ever since, with the Greek position remaining essentially unchanged across nearly 2 centuries of diplomatic engagement. The controversy has in fact gone through several distinct phases, whose character and intensity have varied considerably depending on the specific political and cultural contexts of different periods. Greek advocacy for the return of the sculptures became significantly more organized and more internationally prominent in the 1980s, when the actress and politician Melina Mercouri, serving as Greece's Minister of Culture, made the issue a major focus of international cultural diplomacy and effectively transformed it from a local Greek concern into a global debate about the ownership of cultural heritage. The opening of the new Acropolis Museum in 2009, which provided a modern and technically excellent facility specifically designed to house the sculptures, gave the Greek argument a new practical dimension that had previously been lacking. There is a widespread belief that the Impressionists painted exclusively outdoors, directly from nature, without any studio work or subsequent reworking of canvases, and that the spontaneous freshness of their work is the direct expression of painting done rapidly in the open air without any mediation between the observed scene and the finished canvas. The practice of painting outdoors was central to the Impressionist method, but it was rarely the whole story, and many of the most celebrated Impressionist paintings were significantly reworked in the studio after the initial outdoor sessions that established the composition and the general color key. Monet in particular was known for extensively reworking his canvases after returning to the studio, continuing to revise paintings for months or even years after the initial outdoor work, and his London series was worked on in his Giverny studio for several years after his final visit to the city. Renoir went through a period in the 1880s when he largely abandoned outdoor painting in favor of studio work, and Degas famously preferred the controlled environment of the studio to the discomforts of outdoor painting throughout his career. Most people believe that the art of ancient Egypt was produced by professional artists, in the modern sense, individuals who chose art as their vocation, and who were valued primarily for their personal creative gifts and their individual artistic vision. Ancient Egyptian art was produced by craftsmen who were understood as skilled workers executing established conventional forms rather than as individual creative personalities expressing personal visions, and the specific identities of the individuals who made most ancient Egyptian art are unknown and were considered unimportant by the culture that commissioned the work. The modern concept of the artist as an individual creative personality whose personal vision is the primary source of artistic value was entirely absent from the ancient Egyptian understanding of artistic production, which valued fidelity to established conventions over individual invention, and understood artistic skill as a craft competence rather than a form of personal, creative expression. The projection of modern ideas about artistic individuality onto ancient Egyptian art distorts our understanding of both the art and the culture that produced it. It is commonly believed that the great Dutch still life paintings of the 17th century, the elaborate arrangements of flowers, fruit, food, and precious objects that represent one of the most celebrated achievements of Dutch Golden Age painting, were painted directly from the actual arrangements they depict in a single session before the flowers wilted and the food spoiled. The elaborate still lifes of painters including Jan Davids de Heem, Willem Claes Heder, and Peter Klaas were in fact carefully constructed composite images assembled from multiple studies made at different times and often from different seasons, since many of the flowers depicted in a single composition bloom in different months and could not have been simultaneously present in an actual arrangement. The painters maintained collections of drawings and studies of individual objects that they assembled into composite compositions as needed. and the apparent freshness and naturalism of the arrangements was the product of careful compositional planning rather than the direct transcription of an actual observed scene. The still life's appearance of spontaneous reality is itself a sophisticated artistic construction. Many people believe that the Surrealist movement was primarily a French phenomenon whose key figures were all French, and that its influence was largely confined to the French-speaking world before spreading more gradually to other national traditions. Surrealism was international in its membership from very early in its development, encompassing major figures from Spain, Dalí and Miró, Belgium, René, Magritte, Germany, Max, Ernst, and eventually from across the Americas as European artists fled to the United States and Latin America. During the Second World War, the specifically French character of the movement's official leadership under André Breton reflected the movement's Paris base rather than any essential French quality of its ideas or its practice, and the transplantation of major surrealist figures to New York during the war years had a profound influence on the development of American art in the post-war period that makes the subsequent history of American abstract painting partially unintelligible without understanding the surrealist contribution to the New York art world. There is a popular belief that the term Impressionism accurately describes what the Impressionist painters were trying to achieve, that they were interested in capturing fleeting impressions of visual experience rather than the permanent structural reality of the world they depicted. Several of the painters most closely associated with Impressionism explicitly rejected the idea that their work was concerned with superficial or fleeting impressions rather than with deep visual reality, and Cézanne in particular developed his entire mature practice as a deliberate critique of what he saw as Impressionism's failure to engage with the underlying structure of natural appearances. He described his ambition as wanting to make of Impressionism something solid and durable like the art of the museums, suggesting that the emphasis on the fleeting and the momentary that the term Impressionism implies was for him a limitation to be overcome rather than an achievement to be celebrated. The relationship between the painters grouped under the Impressionist label and the specific qualities that the label implies is considerably more complex and more varied than the term itself suggests. Most people believe that Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks were written in a secret code or cipher that he developed to protect his ideas from being stolen or misused by other people. Leonardo's characteristic mirror, writing the right-to-left script that can only be easily read in a mirror, was almost certainly not a deliberate code or cipher, but simply the most natural and practical way for a left-handed writer to write, since moving the pen from right to left avoided the smearing of wet ink. That was the primary practical problem for left-handed writers using the conventional left-to-right direction. The notebooks were also written in a way that required only a mirror to read a simple device available to anyone rather than any specialized knowledge or key, which would make them a very poor cipher if concealment had been the primary purpose. The idea of the secret code reflects the romantic desire for mystery surrounding Leonardo's genius, rather than the practical reality of his writing habit. It is widely believed that the Impressionist painter Berthe Morisot was a minor figure in the Impressionist group whose participation in the movement was primarily social rather than artistic, and whose work has been celebrated primarily because of her personal connections to the male painters who formed the core of the group, rather than for its intrinsic quality. Morisot was one of the most artistically serious and formally accomplished members of the Impressionist group, exhibiting in 7 of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions more than any other participant, and producing a body of work whose formal qualities and artistic ambition are fully consistent with the finest achievements of any of her male contemporaries. Her exclusion from the canonical narrative of Impressionism for most of the 20th century reflects the gender biases of art historical writing rather than any objective assessment of the quality of her work. And the reassessment of her achievement that has taken place over the past several decades has established her as one of the central figures of the movement rather than a peripheral one. Many people believe that the famous self-portrait by Albrecht Dürer, painted in 1500, in which he depicts himself frontally in a pose that closely resembles conventional images of Christ, was an act of blasphemous self-aggrandizement that shocked and offended his contemporaries and represented a radical departure from the norms of Christian culture. The painting was in fact entirely consistent with a specific tradition of humanist thought about the nature of artistic creativity that understood the artist's God-given creative capacity as a reflection of the divine creativity that had produced the natural world, making the analogy between the artist and the creator a respectful acknowledgement of divine gift rather than a presumptuous claim to divine status. Dürer's use of the Christ-like frontal pose was an expression of this humanist theology of creativity rather than a provocative assertion of personal divinity, and while the painting's formal boldness was certainly remarkable, the theological framework within which it was produced gave it a meaning that was more reverential than blasphemous in the cultural context of Northern European humanism at the turn of the 16th century. There is a common belief that the ancient Olympic Games were a purely athletic competition whose participants competed solely for the honor of victory and the olive wreath awarded to the winner, and that the ancient games were entirely untouched by the commercial pressures and political complications that have affected the modern games. The ancient Olympic Games were deeply embedded in the political, commercial, and social structures of the Greek world, and the athletes who competed in them were far from the simple amateurs of popular legend. Successful athletes received significant material rewards from their home cities, free meals for life, cash payments, and various civic honors, and the competition for victory at Olympia was as much a form of city-state political rivalry as a purely athletic contest. Several ancient sources record accusations of bribery and corruption in Olympic competition, and the management of the games by the city of Elis, which had its own political interests in the outcome, meant that the governance of the ancient games was subject to the same kinds of political pressure that has complicated the history of the modern games. Most people believe that Michelangelo was indifferent to money and entirely focused on the spiritual dimensions of his art, a pure creative spirit who worked for the love of art and God rather than for material reward, and who accumulated no significant personal wealth across his long career. Michelangelo was in fact a shrewd and successful businessman who accumulated considerable personal wealth across his career through a combination of the substantial fees he charged for his work, careful investment in property in Florence and Rome, and the prudent management of his financial resources over many decades. His letters to his family in Florence are filled with detailed financial instructions and expressions of concern about money that reflect a practical engagement with material security very different from the unworldly artistic genius of popular legend. He supported his family in Florence for decades through regular financial transfers, purchased property as a form of investment, and died, leaving an estate of considerable value that passed to his nephew, Leonardo. The artistic spirituality and the financial acuity coexisted without apparent contradiction in a personality of great practical as well as creative intelligence. It is commonly believed that the discovery of perspective, the system of representing three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface that gives Renaissance painting its characteristic depth and spatial recession, was a purely Italian achievement of the early 15th century that had no precedent in any earlier period or any other artistic tradition, while the systematic mathematical formulation of linear perspective by Filippo Brunelleschi in the early 1500s and its subsequent codification by Leon Battista Alberti in his treatise on painting, published in 1430. 5 represented a genuinely significant contribution to the theory and practice of spatial representation. Various approximations of perspectival recession had been explored by painters and artists in earlier periods and other traditions. Ancient Roman painters used rudimentary forms of perspective in their wall paintings. Medieval painters occasionally used overlapping and size diminution to suggest spatial recession, and the specific contribution of the Italian Renaissance was the formulation of a systematic mathematical theory rather than the invention of spatial representation from scratch. Many people believe that the great art collections held by the world's major museums were assembled through straightforward purchases from willing sellers, and that the provenance of most major museum holdings is entirely clear, uncontroversial. A significant proportion of the holdings of the world's major museums were acquired under circumstances that would not be considered acceptable by current ethical and legal standards, and the provenance research that major institutions have undertaken since the 1990s has revealed that numerous works in public collections passed through the hands of Nazi confiscators during the Second World War, or were removed from their countries of origin under the conditions of colonialism in ways that many source communities and national governments consider illegitimate. The repatriation claims that have resulted from this research have generated significant debate about the responsibilities of collecting institutions, the rights of source communities and national governments, and the principles that should govern the international movement of cultural property. There is a widespread belief that abstract art, particularly the non-representational painting that became dominant in the 20th century, is simply easier to produce than representational art, and that the absence of recognizable subjects means that abstract paintings require less skill and less artistic intelligence than works that depict the visible world with accuracy and refinement. The assumption that the difficulty of art is primarily a matter of technical skill in the accurate representation of visual appearances misunderstands the nature of artistic challenge in fundamental ways. The creation of a non-representational composition that achieves a genuine quality of aesthetic experience, that creates a meaningful relationship between color, form, and surface, that produces a sustained and enriching encounter for the viewer, is as demanding as any form of representational painting, and the history of abstract art is full of works that demonstrate both the extraordinary difficulty of the undertaking and the extraordinary range of achievement that is possible within it. The ease with which unskilled work can be produced in any medium is not evidence of the medium's intrinsic simplicity. Most people believe that Vincent van Gogh's letters to his brother Theo were primarily personal correspondence that happened to contain occasional references to his artistic work, and that their significance as documents of his inner life was only recognized after his death, when they were published and read more widely. The letters between Vincent and Theo, of which more than 800 survive, were understood by both brothers as documents of extraordinary significance even during their lifetimes, and Theo took great care to preserve them in full awareness of their importance as records of his brother's artistic thinking. Vincent wrote about his painting with a level of self-awareness and analytical intelligence that gives the letters a quality of sustained art criticism and aesthetic philosophy that goes far beyond personal correspondence, and the full body of letters constitutes one of the most remarkable documents of an artist's creative process available in any period. Theo's wife Johanna, who edited and published the letters in 1914, was the primary architect of the project that made them publicly available, but the letters' significance had been recognized within the family long before their publication. It is commonly believed that the auction records set by major artworks in recent decades, the hundreds of millions of dollars paid for works by Picasso, Modigliani, and Leonardo reflect the genuine market value of these works, and that the prices established at auction represent an accurate and transparent assessment of what the works are worth. Major art auctions are subject to a range of practices that can significantly distort the prices achieved and that make the auction result a less transparent indicator of genuine market value than it might appear. Auction houses frequently guarantee minimum prices to sellers regardless of the auction result, effectively underwriting the risk of a low sale. Bidding rings in formal agreements among dealers to suppress competition have been documented at major auctions. Reserve prices are kept secret from most bidders. And the specific circumstances of individual auctions, the identity of the bidders, the atmosphere in the room, the marketing campaign preceding the sale can produce results that reflect the specific conditions of a single evening rather than any stable assessment of long-term value. The auction result is a price, but it is not necessarily a value. Rembrandt's famous painting, The Night Watch, has long been believed to depict a nighttime scene, a company of civic guards mustering after dark, a belief so deeply embedded in the painting's popular identity that it gave the work the name by which it has been known for centuries. The painting in fact depicts a daytime scene, and the name Night Watch is entirely the result of the accumulated layers of dark varnish that covered the painting for centuries and gave it the appearance of a nocturnal setting that its original colors did not possess. When the painting was cleaned and restored in the 20th century, the removal of the old varnish revealed a palette of considerably greater brightness and color variety than the darkened surface had suggested. And the quality of the light depicted in the painting, the strong sunlight falling on the central figures of Captain Koch and his lieutenant, makes clear that the scene takes place in daylight rather than darkness. The Night Watch has been the wrong name for the right painting for more than 2 centuries, and it is now too deeply embedded in the work's identity to be easily replaced. You can let all of that go now. There is nothing left to hold on to or correct. Somewhere tonight, the great museums are quiet and dark, and the paintings are resting in their frames, and the sculptures are still in their cases, and the truth and the myth are sleeping side by side in the same rooms, and the night is deep and full of rest.